So hello and welcome to my presentation. My name's Sharan Foga and I'm here to tell you a story, so I hope you're all sitting comfortably. Now, stories are really quite interesting because they tend to change each time you tell them. So I have actually given this presentation before, but so if you've seen it, it might be slightly different because, as I say, you tell a story, different things happen, and from the time the story was told before to what we're doing now, things have changed, or things have happened. So what I'm going to talk about, my talk is called Open Source Stories Beginnings, right? And most stories have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. But this story is a little bit different. And it's different because it has a beginning, but it doesn't have an ending. And it doesn't have an ending because it's a story that's actually happening now. So what I'm going to share with you is a story about an open source journey that's happening now, and we're still working through it. So it's evolving, and I hope that sharing this story as it's going on is going to either help you or you can help us with some sort of feedback as well. So let's get started. So one of the things that I always thought when I was young was that stories were always exciting and magical, were always fantasy, magic, dragons, monsters. But now I realise that as I've been going through life, through my career, that some of the more interesting stories, the most sort of compelling stories, are actually real-life stories. So I'm hoping that this story that I'm going to tell you, or the pieces of this story that I'm going to tell you, talk to you about, you're going to find interesting and compelling. So here we go. So every story has various chapters. So I've divided this story up into several chapters. So we'll start with the storyteller, where I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my sort of open source background. And we're going to talk about sort of setting the scene, sort of chapter 1, chapter 2, whatever you want to call it. Beginnings. The talk is called Open Source Stories Beginnings. So when do you know that your open source story starts? How do you know when it's actually started? So what triggers that beginning? The next piece, our tale starts. So there's a bit of a spoiler alert here. So what happens when an open source startup gets acquired by a company that has a lot of complex projects, but mainly of which are not open source? And this is a thing that has been happening, quite more frequently than you'd think. So what's the story? How do you work together? How do you integrate that? So this is what so hope you're still on the edge of your seats, looking interested. The next chapter, unexpected insight, nothing to do with the Lord of the Rings or anything like that, but what are the things that we can find? What are the things that we can see, that may be missing? Are there any gaps that might not have been so obvious? And then looking at starting out on the journey, if we do find these gaps, how do we go about addressing them? How do we go about working together to fill that and integrate and work to find a solution that's sort of equitable to both? And happily ever after, well, I think I've already spoiled that, haven't I? Because I told you that the story doesn't have an ending yet. So the happily ever after, maybe we're working on it. But we'll go through and see. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a brief teaser as to what we're going to cover. So let's get started. So the storyteller, that's me, right? My name's Sharan Foga. People might, some of you might realise or notice that my accent is a bit different. I'm originally from the UK. I sort of describe myself as a bit of a happy traveller. I've spent time working in, sort of outside the UK really, in Belgium, in France, Czech Republic, in New Zealand, and now I'm based out of Stockholm in Sweden. So I am a traveller. You can see from these various photos, I have changed my hair a lot, changed my glasses a lot, but one thing that's constant is my smile. I laugh a lot. I'm a happy person, and I like being happy, and I hope that make other people happy too. I enjoy working in open source. I've been involved in open source for quite a while. I'm a volunteer at the Apache Software Foundation. I've been involved in the Apache with software there since 2008. For the last 3 years, I've been elected as a board member for the Apache Software Foundation, so I'm an actual current board member. So this is my 3rd year, as I say. It's been a really interesting insight into how open source foundations work. So I'm really enjoying that. And in my day job, I work as a Director of Community and Developer Relations at Instaclustr by NetApp. And one of the things that I've done in my career as I've gone through is I've been involved in open source for a long time, but I've also always kept it separate from my day job. So working for Instaclustr, I actually got the opportunity to do the open source thing that I really, really enjoyed as part of my day job. So it was a really, really good mix, really good match. So, what's not to like? So that's the little bit about myself. So let's move on. So first piece now, setting the scenes. So I call this beginnings and once upon a time. So going back to that sort of initial summary, how can you tell when your open source story has started? And how can you actually tell when it started? When does it start, and how can you tell that it started? So if you're an individual, like I say, I use myself, right? I can tell when my open source story started. And I can tell you with accuracy that my open source story started 15 years, 3 months, and 14 days ago, right? You're saying to yourself, right, how does she know? How does she know that it started then? And I know that it started then because I posted 15 years, 3 months, and 14 days ago, I posted my first post to a mailing list, an open source project mailing list. And that is the link there, so when you get the presentation, you can actually go back and see it. But on the 3rd of July, sort of 2008, I posted a bug report to a project, an open source project. And somebody responded to that and said, hey, look, I think you might be right. Let's have a look at the code, da-da-da. And that triggered a conversation. It triggered some correction in the software. And it triggered motivation in me, really, to actually start sending in more bug reports, getting more and more involved with the project, helping with the documentation, helping with events and organising just for this project. Then I got involved with the wider foundation and started getting involved with community development, started helping out other projects, and the thing there now, and that's taken me up to where I am today, right? But if you look at the context, I can tell that my open source story started all those years ago because I'm here today looking back, right? If that event had been an isolated event, then I probably wouldn't be standing here saying, hey, yeah, I've got this open source story. It would have been an isolated event. It's that continuity, that regularity of participation, contribution, and that's the thing that's led to me saying, right, okay, yeah, my open source story started, and my open source journey is continuing, and I'm continuing to be involved in open source. So that's I think is fairly clear. So now another question: how do you tell when a company's open source story starts? Could you use the same thing? Right, I work for a company. Could I say that, because I'm an employee of that company and my open source journey started 15 odd years ago because I work for a company, the company's open source story also started 15 years ago? I would say you probably dispute that. And you probably dispute it for a couple of reasons. One, that the open source contributions that I'm doing could be nothing to do with the company that I work for. And this is how a lot of the open source contributions started. People were working on projects that they enjoyed working on, and they kept that separate from their actual employer. So the employer claiming that just because I've got some people that are contributing to open source that work for me, then I can claim that as the start of my story. That to me doesn't work. And also, a single person is not really representative of a whole company. Well, if you're a CEO, perhaps, but for an open source contribution, a contributor, no. It needs to be something more than that. So how can we say that a company's open source story starts, right? So once again, we said that a company is made up of the people. So could you say that, hey, right, if 20% or 50% of the people are contributing to open source, then yeah, we could say the open source story starts. Well, maybe. But I would say, let's look at it in maybe another way. A company is driven by its goals and its culture and its mission. So if open source is part of the mission or the goals or the culture of the company, then that could be an indication of when a company's open source story starts and if it actually is starting. So if it's aligned or mentioned in as a strategy or as part of the company's goals or strategic values, then you could say, hey, right, yes, this company has prioritized open source or has a relationship or some sort of understanding, of open source. Then, sorry, I've just got a thing coming up on my thing. Then that could indicate that journey has started. So I'm going to make a little bit of a detour here. So let's talk about the road to open source adoption. So there tends to be two approaches for companies adopting open source. There's been a sort of proactive stance or a reactive stance. I think the reactive stance we're probably maybe sort of more old school now, because I think the importance of open source and the fact that open source is so prolific in the corporate stack or actually products and tools that companies really need to be proactive now in understanding the tools that they're using, understanding the compliance process, understanding the risk and managing the risk. So the reactive approach, I think, is probably no longer so valid, but I can appreciate that there probably are companies out there that are not so proactive and then actually reacting to their open source involvement or open source adoption. So just to say a little bit of a slide there. So let's start our tale now. So let's start talking about, we've talked about a little bit about the theory, so let's talk about real life examples now. So here, right, okay. Instaclustr and NetApp, and I know I have quite a few NetApp people here in the audience. So I mentioned that I got my dream job, in November 2021. Went to work for an Australian startup, Instaclustr, and they were founded 2012, 2013, and their open source story actually started not long after they were founded. And the reason their open source story started that early is because they delivered, or they were focused on delivering and working with open source products, right? And if your business is dependent on open source and open source products, then it's important that you understand and participate, support the communities that help feed that software that you're dependent on. And so Instaclustr were quite active. They participated, and they also supported a lot of the community. So the fact that that was all done quite up front, it was there. Also in their mission, their sort of mission and goals, hey, revolutionize the way companies use open source technologies. Open source, front and center, right? Hey, we're a company that's invested in open source. So last year, when Instaclustr got acquired by NetApp, there was a bit of apprehension, right? Because it was sort of like, hey, what's going to happen? We've got a company here that's got a lot of complex products, most of which are not open source. So how do we come together? How do we manage that? Would I still be able to work on open source? And this was a big concern for the team. So one of the things is like, okay, NetApp acquired Instaclustr, so did they also acquire the open source story? Did they open the open source history? I thought, well, okay, let's have a look. Maybe NetApp has its own open source story. And when I went to look, I saw that, NetApp was founded in 1992. And one of the key products that NetApp has, there was based on some code from BSD Unix. So NetApp actually did have some involvement with open source quite early on. So did their open source story start back in 1992? So once again, it's, when you stand here and look back, is there an open source story? Is there an open source journey? We know that, say, Instaclustr have been quite active in participating in the open source communities. So what about NetApp? So NetApp has been participating in the community, but maybe that participation has been actually limited. So it doesn't look as if there is some continual, regular participation, but there is some participation. So once again, it's like there's a journey where you've got a lot of active participation, and there's a journey where it may be not as frequent. So how do we move forward with this? So I mentioned the big concern that we had around the acquisition, and hey, can we still work on open source? Would we have to stop doing the way that we were working? Well, no, we didn't have to change, but some things are different. And one of the key things that we noticed that was different is you had a company of maybe sort of 300 people, and now we're part of a company that's like 11,000 or so people. When you join a company that sort of size, there's processes in place for everything, right? Including open source. And the reason that there's processes in place for companies like that is because there's IP, right? And so if you look at the sort of Instaclustr model, there was no sort of IP secret source to protect. So the actual being able to push stuff upstream, the risk was quite low. But if you've got a corporate company that does have IP, the secret source that they're concerned about not wanting to leak that out, then yes, the processes that they put in place are really quite formidable, I would say, okay? Because it's a protection mechanism. So what happens when you have a process that is designed for IP protection and perhaps not as frequent sort of upstream pushes, acquire a company or where there's more frequent upstream pushes. So effectively, you have a lot of work that needs to be pushed upstream, but then it has to go through a process that was maybe not designed to be as frequent. So we could see that, hold on, there might be a potential roadblock coming up here because we need to be able to we need to be able to work with the open source communities. So what happened, right? This was raised as a concern. Hey, look, we need to keep working. The risk is low. We don't have any secret source to leak. Can we do something? Can we find a way to be able to continue the contribution at the level that we're doing, and still adhere to the process? So, what happened was we found a way to be able to get some pre-approval for the upstream pushes because the IP there was no IP risk. It was low, and we were trying to make sure that we could still manage the way that our business interacted with the community and participated and supported the open source projects that we depended on. Because that's really, really important. So this is an example of how, when after the acquisition, we identified a potential problem in trying to integrate, but then we also found a solution to get over that. So that solution worked. This is another sort of slight diversion here as well. So I don't know how many of you have heard about the To-Do group. They're an organisation or a group of people and companies that put together resources and materials for companies interested in open source program offices. And a lot of companies that deal or use or consume open source have established an open source program office. What they have put together is a maturity model at the different levels, showing how a company can progress from the lowest to a sort of like a higher level in open source program office awareness and open source awareness. So I've summarised this in a sort of very basic level. There's more details in there than this, and you can find that on the To-Do group website. But I've put it at this type of level so that you can see some of the key points that people need to achieve. So level 0, I think, this is not, even though it's there, I mean, I think realistically, if you're corporate, if you're doing that, you're in trouble, right? So most corporates start at the level 1 or stage 1, providing that open source compliance, making an inventory of the open source software that they have, and educating their developers around the licensing risk. And this is exactly what NetApp has done. A lot of the processes that they have around the compliance and in being able to stop or mitigate the risk of IP leaking out of the company is around that OS compliance. And I think this is common in all corporates. But one thing I just wanted to highlight here is that I mentioned that my role is around developer relations, and part of our role is around evangelism, working with the ecosystem, participation. So you can see from this is actually that the work that we were doing at the sort of Instaclustr was looking at some of the part in level 2 here, whereas the company that we have sort of acquired us are sort of focused on the level 1. So I think that's an interesting insight in the sense that we have some skills in the open source arena that we can share with the company that acquired us because we have a bit more experience in that area. So another thing to note here, so To-Do group, you can be a member of this the To-Do group, and all the companies that are members of the To-Do group are ones that are invested in open source program offices or keen to learn or establish open source program offices. Now, NetApp is a member of the To-Do group. Instaclustr is not. So that's interesting, an interesting fact. So I thought, hey, you think, right, okay, this company is more focused on open source here, this one isn't. But then hold on, you find, okay, this one does have an interest in open source. And this one, yeah. So this is, I think, gathering the information and seeing where what's happening and where people want to go is really quite interesting. So here, yeah. So one of the things that I've done, you might realise that I like to talk a lot, so I do talk a lot. So one of the things that I've done, it's been something like 15 months. I haven't got it down to the day like I have my open source contribution. It's been about 15 months since the acquisition. And one of the things that I've been doing is actually talking to people. So I've been talking to people, meeting people, anybody that's involved with open source in sort of NetApp. I've been trying to locate or make contacts and build a network of the people that are doing open source. Now, this was really quite interesting to me because I thought, NetApp's not doing very much open source. Because if you sort of, I don't know, search or Google NetApp and open source, you don't really find so much. But actually, within the company, there's a lot of open source work going on. And I was quite surprised to see that or to hear about that. But I think by making those connections, so I email people, met people, talked to people, tried to find out, hey, what are they doing? What's their interest in open source? How are they working? How are they communicating? And as a result of all my talking, we actually found something. So what did we find? We found, actually, some gaps. Potential gaps. I think they're gaps, but yeah, we're potential gaps. We probably still need to work on that. So one of the gaps that we found, and the first big gap that I found, is around open source strategy. Articulating what the role of open source is now for the business. Is open source a key part of the business for NetApp? Maybe, but how? And if it isn't, then how is it affecting the products that are being created now? So how do we? But I think that there is with the acquisition, I think there is an open source story there. But how do we articulate that? Yeah. As part of coordination, so open source coordination, as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of pockets of open source activity happening in the company, not compliance related, because I think compliance that process is definitely covered. So we don't have a sort of centralized view of how are the open source groups or the teams that are working on the open source managing together. So I think we don't have that view. Communication, what's the open source story or interest? I think one of the ways that you look at open source is it's a tool. It's something that people can use. So how do you communicate what you're achieving and what you're doing with that open source? OS participation and engagement. So I mentioned that it's something that we have been, the Instaclustr side of the team has been doing. So, here you look at some of the open source events like this one. A key thing for open source communities is around participation and engagement and support. So how can companies engage and support open source in a better way? So I think it's a lot easier to sort of work on these gaps when you're a smaller company, but if you're a larger company, then it's a bit more complex. So these are some of the areas that we've found that, hey, we could do some work on this. So when we look at this now, so what is it that we can do to sort of fill those gaps? And if you look at some of the things that were coming out in that list of sort of potential gaps, they're pointing towards some sort of coordination. So you look at things like the OS strategy, education, so external communication. As I say, there's a lot of work that NetApp is doing in open source, but we maybe not getting the word out to show that what is actually happening. Some of the coordination I mentioned, the knowledge, maybe helping sharing the knowledge that around open source participation and interaction, the communication, maybe reporting of what's happening within open source. So we're actually sort of setting out on a journey. So some of the things that we're actually working on at the moment, we were working on formulating some sort of open source strategy, and what that would look like. What is the interest, the open source interest within the company. We're working on a proposal, to maybe establish an open source program office, some sort of central point, like a front door, an open source front door that could be used for internal and external. We're thinking about, how do we communicate that open source interest? How do we tell people, what we're doing? And we're looking at, the participation, education programs for both internal developers as well, to understand and better interact with the open source communities. And we're going out to events, open source events like this one, and talking about the story. So I think, I hope you can see now when I say, hey, we've got a beginning of a story, but we don't have an end of a story. Because the journey that we're going on is still happening now. And we don't know, how it's going to end. We don't know, where we know where we want to go, but we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. And I'm sure that we're not the only company in this situation that are dealing with open source participation, open source engagement. And I think I'd hope that this talk has sort of, given people an idea of, hey, comments, feedback. Can you, if you share any feedback or questions from your own journey as we go through this, because whatever you have may be able to help us. So we talked about this happily ever after. Have we got a happily ever after scenario? We don't know. The story isn't finished yet. It's still going. So, and we know that life is the ecosystem and the life is not so constant. So we've had ups, downs, and unknowns. We know that we were a smaller organisation of 300 people, and and it's okay to implement smaller processes. But now we're joining this bigger organisation with 11,000 people worldwide, varied portfolio, complex projects, complex products. Different processes. How do we get the buy-in and participation at a sort of corporate level? How do we scale? How do we find a way to work together, and how do we scale that in an organisation that size? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all, because I think people, every company that goes through these sort of challenges, they have to navigate those. So what's happening at the moment? As I say, we're helping, to fill some of the FOSS, skills, open source skill gaps, and we're on a journey with that knowledge. I think that, like I say, I think that there's a big sort of predicament for large companies, open source strategies and how to manage that. So, we still need to work on that. For me, as an open source enthusiast, I really, really want to help NetApp become more engaged in open source. But I also really want to make sure that we, bring ourselves together. I think there's some work that we probably need to do internally. And then once we've achieved that, then we can, talk a bit more openly, externally about that. So, we're looking for participation across the business. Right, so our next steps, we've identified some gaps. We need to align our strategy. We need to communicate what we're doing and how we plan to achieve that. And we need to start coordinating that open source knowledge and operations sort of internally. And, one of the biggest things that we were thinking about is trying to get this open source program office set up. So one thing I really wanted to highlight here, I mean, this thing about, big company, startup, just because you're a company that's been acquired doesn't mean that you don't have the skills to be able to help mentor or help fill gaps in knowledge that the acquiring company may have. So, and I think that that's the thing that can bring us together through the integration, is by working together to try and fill those gaps around that open source piece. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. So thank you very much for your attention.